Hey, what's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 161, and we're going to cover Nehemiah chapters 11 and 12. Last time we left off, we saw Israel confessing their sins, and we covered one of the most beautiful prayers that we've seen in all of Scripture. And today is going to pick up with Nehemiah basically setting everything in order. And so the rest of the chapters, 11 and 12 today, and we'll cover 13 tomorrow, is basically the details of Nehemiah setting things in order and a summary of how he exercised his leadership as governor. As for instance, in our two chapters today, Jerusalem and Judah were uprooted in the captivity, and now they're resettled. And so this is how Nehemiah goes about doing it. In verse 1, it says, "Now the leaders of the people settled in Jerusalem. The rest of the people cast lots to bring one of every 10 of them to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while the remaining 9 were to stay in their own towns. The people commended all who volunteered to live in Jerusalem." And so basically what you have here is, remember, the system of casting lots had developed in Scripture and had become a prominent way in Israel on how to engage in decision making. And we've seen a lot of different ways that Israel engaged in decision making that would be unfamiliar to us. For instance, when we looked at the Urim and Thummim back with the high priest and how the lighting of that breastplate would help the priest make decisions. And so this is one of the older decision-making processes, and we even see it come into the New Testament as we move further into the New Covenant. There's a different way of decision-making, and we'll cover that in the New Testament. And so Nehemiah's plan is he wants to redistribute the land well and settle the population. So what he does is, out of every 10 Jews, 1 had to stay in Jerusalem, and the other 9 were free to go stay wherever they wanted in the land. And so after this, in verse 3, it says, "These are the provincial leaders who settled in Jerusalem. Now some Israelites, priests, Levites, temple servants, and descendants of Solomon's servants live in the towns of Judah, each on their own property in various towns, while other people from both Judah and Benjamin lived in Jerusalem." And so you get a breakdown of these people, which is basically we've come to know as a census. We've seen census in Numbers chapter 1 and 26. We saw David sin when he took the census in the ill-advised way. And here's another census. First, you get the descendants of Judah in verse 4, then Benjamin in verse 7, your priests in verse 10 and following, the Levites in verse 15 to 18, and the gatekeepers in verse 19 throughout the rest of the chapter. And chapter 12 names the priests and the Levite who returned to Jerusalem with Zerubbabel, as stated in verse 1. These were the priests and Levites who returned with Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and with Joshua. These were the leaders and the priests and their associates in the days of Joshua. And so this chapter continues to name the priests and the Levites, and it states in verse 26 that Nehemiah was the governor and Ezra the priest and the teacher of the law. And then the wall is dedicated. In verse 27, it says, "At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, the Levites were sought out from where they lived and were brought to Jerusalem to celebrate joyfully the dedication with songs of thanksgiving and with the music of cymbals, harps, and lyres. The musicians were also brought together from the region around Jerusalem, the village of the Netophathites, from Beth Gilgal, and from the area of Geba and Asmavet, for the musicians had built villages for themselves around Jerusalem. When the priests and the Levites had purified themselves ceremonially, they purified the people and the gates and the walls. I had the leaders of Judah go up to the top of the wall, and I also assigned 2 large choirs to give thanks. One was to proceed at the top of the wall to the right, toward the dung gate. Hoshea and half the leaders of Judah followed them. And so some of these priests played trumpets, and this was done with musical instruments, accompaniment prescribed by David, the man of God. Ezra, the teacher of the law, led the procession at the fountain gate, and they continued directly up the steps of the city of David, the ascent of the wall, and passed above the site of David's palace to the water gate on the east. And verse 43 says, "And on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced." And there were men who were appointed to be in charge of the storerooms of the contributions, first fruits, and tithes. And so we see a celebration here. But I want to back up. What don't we see? We don't see all of that pain, suffering, those trials, that discouragement, those tribulations, that persecution that it took to get here. And I want you all to take note of that this was the path to the will of God for Ezra and Nehemiah. It came with great opposition. And so when you're on the path to the will of God in your life, plan for opposition. Don't allow it to attack you by surprise and say, oh, wow, opposition is going to come with this journey. No, go ahead and put it in your playbook on how you will respond when opposition comes your way when you're in the will of God, so that you will respond well. And so you can get to the other end of opposition and celebrate and rejoice, just like Ezra and Nehemiah are. They're still having to deal with sin and put reforms in place, but we're going to deal with that to the end of time. Sin isn't going anywhere until Jesus fully brings it into subjection and ends it once and for all. We'll continue to bring forth righteousness in this sin-cursed world. And that's my encouragement for you today. Sometimes you will go through times of war, and sometimes you'll go through times of peace. Respect them both, honor them both, enjoy your times of peace, but always be sober and alert, knowing that your shoulder will be tapped and you will be called back to battle. Be at what I call a rest alert. You're resting, you're recovering, but you're still alert, knowing that you are a soldier of God and that you're on his battlefield. So continue to fight this battle with endurance, because you're tied to a long line of godly men. And we're in this for something bigger than ourselves. We're not trying to live out our own dreams and visions. We're trying to live out God's. And God's vision is way larger than ours. You're a part of something special. You're a part of something special, brothers and sisters. Play your part. Man your post. A lot of times people won't be watching, but those eyes who look to and fro, seeking to support someone whose heart is truly his, will always be watching you. Be faithful to him and him alone. You guys take care, and we'll close out Nehemiah on tomorrow.